I was thinking about this talk. It occurred to me that this is as much a personal story as it is a scientific story, and I think that giving you my background as a psychologist, now sort of hybrid neuroengineer and network analyst, makes some sense out of the way I'm approaching these issues. And I think as I've started to try and study these issues empirically and write about them conceptually, I'm finding that I'm encountering not just the scientific process, but a social process, and that entails review processes, grant rejections, paper rejections, and then hopefully improvement of that work to get to a certain outcome. And the reason that I'm asking this question, so what do people think is right and wrong to do with neuroenhancement, is it occurs to me that we actually know very little about that question. Like myself as an academic, I'm encountering what a sort of rarefied audience thinks about it when I'm trying to write to certain communities. But I really want to be spending most of the time today thinking about sort of the other end, the public that's funding the research that we do, is hopefully benefiting from it, but is also encountering and interacting with it in ways that we don't yet quite understand. And I think that they might have quite a bit to teach us about what we can be doing in this space. So I just want to give you a sense of how I come to these issues sort of intellectually and experientially, frankly. So as Martha was alluding, one core area of the work that we do in our group is what I've kind of referred to as cognitive network neuroscience. So thinking about core models of cognitive function and then how they can be expressed in brain networks and how we can be modifying those processes with brain stimulation. And I'm adopting this buzzword precision to mean that I'm trying to find the right things at the right scale at the right time, and then using tools from engineering or network analysis to make decisions about how to stimulate somebody. And throughout that effort, I sort of have always been nagged that I'm usually thinking about the issues adjacent to what I'm actually doing while I'm doing the much more technical work. So these labs, our own or others, are kind of bustling hives. We've got a lot of subject sessions going on. We're fighting a lot of fires. We're running experiments. And we have a sort of natural laboratory to watch our own decision making and think about how that influences patients, ourselves, and anybody out in the environment. And so when I approach this, the particular way I'll give this talk is going to be fundamentally driven, I think, from personal struggles that I experienced originally in high school. I thought I was going to be an engineer after my father, who was an aerospace engineer for many years. And I took a left turn for psychology when I was in a more reflective phase, thinking about my own personal struggles, my family struggles. And I became fundamentally interested in questions about how we suffer and how we can thrive. And I immediately kind of sought the traditional solution. I thought that I might be a full-time psychotherapist originally, and I really had the vision that I'd be working with cognitive behavioral or other therapies and helping people work through their issues through that interaction. But like many young people, I saw the pretty brain images in the news and in the laboratories, and I suddenly thought, aha, I can look into the brain and find the thing I'm looking for, and if I can just get to the right part of that, I can tweak it and make things better. That was something I believed and I wanted to believe in throughout my graduate education. As soon as you start looking at brains, the closer you look, the less you know, I find. And I said, okay, there's got to be some way to deal with all of this complexity and find some simple things my stupid primate brain can hang on to make a little more order out of it and do something good with that. So that brought me to Moss and Penn. I teamed up with Danny Bassett, Roy Hamilton, and Sharon Thompson-Schill, and I was trying to basically push together these disparate fields of network science, engineering, rehabilitation, and cognitive science. And then, as Martha said, landed over at Drexel. I didn't have to go far. I'm glad to maintain a role over here as well. I'm often back and forth across the campuses, and it's really just a wonderful environment to continue doing this work. So, as a little bit of context, you should be aware, if you're not, that neuromodulation is proliferating. And so what I mean by neuroenhancement is anything that can mediate through the nervous system to enhance some kind of function, broadly defined. And I want you to think about the means by which we can do this. I could be talking to an individual on the screen and trying to do that in a cognitive behavioral therapy context, all the way down to implanting devices and directly modulating brain circuits to achieve an outcome. And there's some difference not just in spatiotemporal precision to how I can do these things, but in form and the content I can access. So I don't think it's a coincidence that talking therapy works well for certain kinds of things and not others, and deeper brain stimulation is more popular and widely used in some deep motor disorders than others. This has some relationship to the severity of the things we're dealing with and the nature of how they're represented and work in the brain. And so people have tried many ways of dealing with these. We're all familiar with pharmaceuticals. These are examples of non-invasive brain stimulation devices like we principally use in our work. These are deep brain stimulation devices that are implanted for, say, Parkinsonism, obsessive compulsive disorder, or other syndromes people are investigating. In comparative models, we can use techniques called optogenetics, where we can use some genetically modified organism and then stimulate that with some kind of patterned light. And more recently, I think what has started to really thread these together into a compelling new thing that's part of what I want to convince you of today is the idea that we can actually aim to achieve things like personalized control. And that, to me, is one of the innovations from the engineering perspective. And so the better I can understand the constituent elements of these systems, how they connect to one another and drive one another, the better I can think about solutions that forward engineer into that system to achieve the desired outcome. So if the outcome is cognitive, that's what I mean by cognitive neuroengineering. I just happen to be using engineering thinking to optimize outcomes. So as soon as you do this, you notice that there are little engineering systems everywhere, and you can put devices to do anything to any one of these systems in principle. So we have mobile devices that can be used in ecological settings. In our lab, we might have much heavier equipment that we have a lot of precise control over, but it's less mobile. And then people can take things inside their body and carry them around with them. And real-world enhancement is here, whether we like it or not. And I was having a conversation earlier at lunch today, and the questions sometimes come up, what do you think we ought to do about this? And always my response is, well, this is already happening all around us, whether we're paying attention or not. There are these new innovations and devices, there are new uses for them, and commercialized techniques have a very low bar to entry in terms of the outcomes. There's sort of a modest safety weight to that, but not necessarily a high demand for evidence that it does anything they claim it does. People can bring these things into the home environment. Anna Wexler here has done a lot of work in the area about the culture around what people do with these devices. They can be integrated and mobile. They talk well to one another. They can be reading out and reading into the brain. They can be connecting machines to our minds, and they can be reading our minds out to help people do things such as regain lost speech. So many of these devices are still relatively rudimentary compared to some of our science fiction analogies to them, but I would argue that this is just a time problem. This is not a will it happen problem. Every one of these things is moving very quickly. There are a lot of very smart people working on deep, hard problems, but it's hard to imagine that we're going anywhere backwards on that dimension. So I have to bring up the sort of scientific instantiation of mind control to do what I need to do next. So I am obsessed with this question. Sometimes, depending on my mood, when somebody asks me what I study, I just say mind control, and then how they react tells you a lot about what you're going to have happen next. So if I tell engineers this, I find that they actually don't disagree with the details of what I say. They care about the reactions that people will have to it. What they're concerned about is if I call the things I'm talking about mind control, the public will have a panic about it, and then they're going to shut down our labs and then overregulate us even further, and there's going to be some kind of panic incited. Potentially a very reasonable concern. I want to flip that around to say, if you call it mind control, you might start noticing ethical liabilities and be sensitive to psychological things about how we react to these devices you might not otherwise see. So there's something about the idea of mind control that I think many of us find aversive and indeed scary intuitively, in the same way that we might be scared that don't let the secret out in the public. Now, what do I mean by this in an engineering sense? Fundamentally, I mean something very basic but principled in the engineer sense. If you imagine you have some control input, so I don't care if it's a drug dose or an electrical current or a magnetic field, you might have some ordered relationship between that input into the brain and some kind of neural change. Simply put, it could be many dimensions or one dimension, doesn't matter. There's maybe a relationship there. And like most systems, you're probably not going to have a perfect fit. There's a little bit of noise about that, but we can quantify these things. There can be numbers to describe everything about what's on that picture. I can then think about, well, there's some neural activity here. How is that related to cognition? This is what most of us call cognitive neuroscience. And then if I notice that I can just hop through these dimensions to one another, I have maybe some ordered relationship between the input and cognition. And in fact, I don't necessarily even need to measure the brain to measure things like this on the right. What I mean by mind control is basically proportional to how well you can articulate this line and how small that noise margin is. That's what I mean. So if that were a perfectly straight line, that would mean that whatever that cognitive output is, be it how I'm talking to you, how I'm walking, however broadly or narrowly defined, if I can stimulate it in some way and I know exactly where that behavior is going to go, I would argue I have a fully controlled system in the engineer's sense. Most systems are very hard to control. Brains are especially hard to control. So we're going to expect, especially initially, a lot of noise here. The relationships are going to be ugly. But again, as tools improve, we should expect them to be better controlled, progressively and in one direction. In this past year was one of the first really compelling examples that we're starting to get our teeth into this problem. This is from Robert Reinhardt's group up at Boston University. He was showing that we can use non-invasive frequency-tuned stimulation to improve short-term or working memory in elderly adults. So let me just kind of break down briefly how this looks, which will help motivate what comes to follow. So there's been a theory for a while that, like in many physical systems, long-distance communication is a hard problem. We tend to use lower frequency signals to communicate further in most engineered systems. So a theory came along at one point that, hey, maybe one of the ways that we communicate across the network is we have a sort of low frequency property that communicates at a longer distance, and then maybe the things happening locally are at a much higher frequency. And so these might couple to one another. Maybe the lower frequency drives the higher frequency, and that induces the effects you want. And so it turns out that a lower frequency domain signal called theta band activity actually entrains some higher frequency signals called gamma band activity. So this is several hertz in cycles, and then this might be many hertz in cycles. And what you can do is engineer a device to try and induce this lower frequency signal and then increase the odds that you get this high frequency signal somewhere else in the brain. So you're trying to entrain those signals as a function of the low frequency. So what was done is taking a montage of high definition transcranial alternating current. We have a montage that will go somewhere back here on the left temporal lobe and then up here on the anterior frontal lobe. And we can do some modeled effect of how the current flows. And then finally, we can measure some difference in the neural effect. And in this particular study, these properties lined up well. And what Reinhardt and colleagues convincingly showed that if here, these are healthy young adults, like some of you in the room, some other of us are on the aging end and we're going a little bit older, we're going to tend to have less accuracy in our memory, maybe as much as 10% in a healthy aging population. And using this montage with this technique, they were able to show that this box became virtually indistinguishable from the younger adults. And this is a reasonably well-designed and powered study. What I want to say to you is that this is sort of one of the frontiers that we need to be monitoring, in the sense that this was about a 25-minute stimulation with maybe about an hour of effect. But the idea is that the basic neuroscience was sound, the sequence could be engineered to the person, and then we could have reliable outcomes across the sample that get them back to people 10 decades younger than they were. This is an incredibly compelling result for clinical purposes, but it implies something deep about our understanding about how that circuit works, that we can exploit to, in this case, drive something that we all might crave as we age, but we have to worry about the other side of that coin. All right, so finally, I think you're primed. I'm here to ask today, before the slide evinces itself, what do people think is right and wrong to do with neuroenhancement? And I think that to motivate this question, I want to point out that I'm confronted by people in this room. There are people around the world that are more or less aware of all of the issues that I just brought up to you. And we need to be thinking about the stakes involved in the concepts they used to interact with these issues. I want to bring up the idea that there are several constituencies in the order in which they exist as part of the issue when we're thinking about these. On the left side, we can consider us as individuals, and individuals often comprise folks that have been thinking about these issues well before the technology. We might call some of them philosophers and ethicists. People that are actually creating and using these techniques, so clinicians and researchers, and the public, sort of the ones we often other when we put ourselves in one of these categories. Institutions, we might sometimes forget, comprise of people. There are people that sit in the rooms that make decisions about regulations. They make ethical decisions for your IRB. Many of us curse under our breath when it's really frustrating to get a protocol through because we just need to get to the next study to pursue the next stage of funding. So there's this push and pull between these constituencies to achieve certain outcomes that might be more or less beneficial from the individuals within any one system, and the systems constrain the actions and the decision making of those who constitute them. So some of the stakes that we should keep in mind is what priorities should be funded, what risks of harm are acceptable. Is a costly, unsuccessful treatment a kind of harm? What unseen trade-offs exist and who's incented to observe them? When are we responsible to look for those trade-offs? Who gets treated or tested and who doesn't? How well does it need to work to use it? How and when do we regulate it? And fundamentally, what ought we do and whose opinion should count the most? So I would like to argue to you that we're all involved in a much bigger cycle that transcends ourselves. And so at one point, we were all in this container I'm calling the public. You had values, ideologies, different beliefs, you had politics, you were persuaded by different things in your life. At some point, many or all of you went to an undergraduate education where you may be now. Some smaller subset move on to graduate education, and then an even smaller specialization becomes a neuromodulation neuroscience expert. And then there are these little leaks in that pipeline. Many of us, most of us, are not making it all the way to the end of that and go on to influence things through law and policy, corporations, doing things at home, making prescriptions not just to patients but to family members and so on. And fundamentally, we can categorize things into some more positive outputs. So these are things that are effective as technologies and treatments. They're appropriate referrals, and they're leading us on the line to some kind of consent to a beneficial practice that we might agree about. The negative outputs can be then the opposite of most of these: snake oils, salespersonship, ineffective technologies, and bad outcomes that induce harm into individuals. These outputs feed back to the public, who then drive the engine all over again. And what we decide to incent with our funding dollars, our science, and other incentives will carry on and on. So what does the NIH incent me to do? Well, it would be nice if I had a treatment. It would be nice if I had some notion of its connection to an outcome, and I probably have no clue at first how it works. So this is how a lot of things work in pharmaceutical or other medical sciences. But I might postulate a mechanism, and I might have a path through that mechanism and some difference in outcome, and this is sort of consistent with what the NIH research domain criterion are at least purported to induce. So I want you to think about how to go after mechanism-induced outcomes and do better and better. What's not on here necessarily is any clear incentive at what trade-offs I should be measuring. So once I start doing something to make something better, I don't have any principled reason to expect something else might not get worse when I start tampering with something as complicated as a brain network. So I don't think it was a coincidence that now, going on about 2 decades ago, the International Neuroethics Society was founded. And what tends to come up in those conversations is that we have ethical issues that come up because we're constantly improving our understanding of the brain and how we can monitor and influence it. We also have a deepening understanding of our own bases of agency and ethical decision making. So the nature of decisions is now investigable within our scientific regime. And a more succinct way of putting this that I rather like from Adina Roski's is the ethics of neuroscience and the neuroscience of ethics. And so what I'd kind of like to elevate to equal status there is the psychology is still part of that neuroscientific endeavor, how people think. You have to keep in mind, as you look at this as a psychologist, that there are acculturated beliefs that are sometimes instituted through formal doctrines. So the Belmont Report famously roughly encodes this principle of beneficence, or do no harm, sometimes phrased as first do no harm. And right after you think about that for a moment, you realize that almost never in the real world does somebody do something and believe with 100% confidence that there's no possible negative consequence of that action. So really what that means is people are trying to reduce the likelihood or the severity of incidental harms or harms connected to the outcomes that we care about. We often think about justice, and so many ways to phrase this term, but of course we can think of it as something about reasonable, non-exploitative procedures that have some fair distribution. So it's the idea of fairness about who gets access and equality. And once you look at these terms, of course, we think about, well, rather than equality, maybe we need to supply different amounts to different people, and indeed maybe a form of justice is to remove the barriers in the first place. And so it's what we deploy and how we regulate it. And finally, and most crucially today, respect for persons, and importantly, the principle of autonomy. And one definition I find useful here is the capacity for persons, often thought of as agents, to make informed, uncoerced choices. And this is something under the basis of informed consent. Lastly, I want to just introduce the coarsest of possible distinctions from philosophy. You might be familiar with consequentialism and deontology. And as a brutal summary that no doubt philosophers in the room will dislike, I would apologize. Something like the right to maximize good consequences, or it is right to abide by rules, rights, and duties, not necessarily the consequences of those. Judge the utility of the outcomes versus the goodness, regardless of those outcomes. And that you can basically have a distinction between bad outcomes with good intentions, making bad actions, versus bad outcomes with good intentions, mitigating how you judge those actions. And Tanya Lombroso, some years ago now, a little over a decade, adopted some of these famous trolley car problems and basically started to approach this idea that people have natural philosophical dispositions, but as a psychologist. So how can I understand whether or not these persuasions influence people's thinking and behavior? So she basically just chose to show people trolley car problems where, if you're not familiar, basically you've got a trolley coming down the track. You can either shove a person off the bridge to stop it, or flip a switch. And you can choose to shove the person or not, or flip the switch or not. And so these are simple ways of counting up. If you're a pure utilitarian, you might go ahead and say, well, you're in some way obligated to make sure that you're only knocking out one person rather than many. That's the simple paradigm. And she showed, somewhat convincingly, that sure, consequentialists are a little bit more likely to do this than others, but you'll notice there's an error. Yeah, sorry.
So what do you think about like work by Jim Everett and Guy Kane suggesting that really this isn't consequentialism or utilitarianism, at least, that we're looking at, right? So, really what people sort of show is like a less sensitivity to harm concerns towards others. And, you see this like correlated with psychopathy and stuff like this. So, so is this really, do these dilemmas really enable us to get at those philosophical?
You're ahead of my punchline. I'm going to say no, and I'm going to show you why we should do something else.
Actually,
good primer.
Can you just explain what these trolley car diagrams?
Sure, right. So I'm not sure how familiar people go with moral psychology. So if you're going to be a moral psychologist, you've got to go understand trolley car problems. So that's your job description.
I'm a chemical physicist, so.
All right, so we're going to go ahead. I know, Abby. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to say, all right, there's a trolley coming down the line. There's some nefarious person tied down all of these people in a comical villainous way out of a 1950s comic, and then you're going to have two ways of averting a possible disaster. You can either take a somewhat corpulent fellow or woman and go behind them and shove them off the bridge. And somehow the mass and momentum and whatever of this person will stop the trolley. You're only going to lose the corpulent individual versus, oh, we can flip the switch. I don't have to actually push a person, but I can get the equivalent outcome. The trolley would switch tracks and run over one person rather than five.
But we always end up killing one person and saving five.
Correct.
So what's supposed to be the difference between those?
The difference between them is supposed to be psychological and a philosophical cognitive disposition. Some people might have more of an aversion to one over the other. Presumably this tells us something about the moral reasoning. Caveat what we just discussed here. Let me get to that just for the sake of getting to some more meat here. This is my primer for why we need to do better than this, okay? So this is good work in the sense that up to about that point, nobody was actually taking these ideas of you have different philosophical dispositions, but we can use cognitive psychology to compare them, okay? So let me actually skip the details just for time here. Just to give you a flavor for how they did these responses, you might have a deontological one. It's just a rule. It's never morally permissible to lie. It's very rigid and very concrete. If it's consequential, if it produces a net good more than bad, it's morally permissible to lie, and then you can have an extreme version of that. And what Tanya went on and showed was basically that if you look at the frequency of these responses, people actually vary in terms of how consequential they are about different categories of traditionally undesirable behaviors, okay? So over here in torture, people tend to think that a rule more applies. Over here on the spectrum of lying. It's okay to lie sometimes if the ends justify those means. The most important thing I want to orient you to as a psychologist is that there was no bimodal distribution even in a very simple measure of consequentialism. So if you just sort of ask people how they self-identify in these philosophical dimensions, and this has been shown in other ways, people kind of lump into some sort of fuzzy continuum. The skew might be different, the shape might be different depending on how you do it, but something like that. So really the only couple of questions I want to motivate here today and move to maybe a different way of dealing with this is what in fact do people think is right and wrong to do, and does what they think predict what they do? These are fundamentally two of the things we want to be getting at. All right, so finally, public attitudes and why should we care? And I want to say that again, the public in these methods is a subset of the space that we can be dealing with. And this is what I hope to convince you of in the next 5 minutes or so. This is the thing that got me to do this, I think, in the end. So I'd been looking, I'd been aware of some of this moral philosophy work and trolley car problems. I found them sort of interesting mathematically and conceptually. But again, the problem was, what does it have to do with the real world? And when you go and you survey public attitudes as recently as 2016, Pew showed that when you ask a simple question like, hey, how worried or enthusiastic would you be about a brain chip implant for much improved cognitive abilities, so not a lot of window dressing, but just making your cognition a lot better, about 2 to 1 worries to enthusiastic. That was really interesting to me because to me, I'm a spoiled audience, right? I'm sitting there in a brain stimulation lab feeling willy-nilly happy about doing this, and I think you're going to get up and be okay, and I've done you no harm. But 2 out of 3 people out there, if I go a little bit more futuristically, are very concerned about this. So this is interesting. So this gets me concerned about, just like we have anti-vaxxers, might we have some anti-zappers or the potential of them. And I was noticing at the time that from Reese et al. Back around the same time of Tanya Roach's study, the public was also more reluctant to use pharmaceuticals for certain psychological attributes more than others. So again, the public's a stakeholder in this, and I became curious about what drives their willingness to use brain stimulation and enhance cognition, and how could we change the public's perception if that was our goal. So here the question is, do we need a decision science for neuroethical judgments? So this was to our questioner here in the back. We need to use different tools perhaps to get at some of these problems. And so if I want to come along and start nudging around the behavior and the education and the outcomes in this cycle to make it more good outcomes than bad, however we might decide what that means, that's a conversation we should have, then I have to come in and know something about the psychology of that and what levers I can pull. This is the same problem as what I'm thinking about when I'm trying to do brain stimulation to enhance somebody's language function. I'm thinking about doing that for the decisions about how we can nudge around decisions for neuroethics. And so I'll skip this for the sake of time. We're writing this up, but it's a little bit tangential, I'm noticing. So I want to point out that in decision science, this is principally developed around economic choice. I think it's not coincidental that people like to know what nudges money decision making around so they can make some more money. But we've learned a lot about this. So if you think about subjective and objective judgments, we have on one side, kind of an extreme, we have personal experiences and values. They lead to sort of your heuristics in the sense of Kahneman and Tversky, your fast calculations, this is what I'll do when I'm rushed. You'll have a subjective guess about a probability of an outcome. So that's sort of like, it's cloudy, that means it might rain, I'll take my umbrella, I'm being safe by making that judgment. This is a kind of decision under uncertainty. You could also try to get some data, do a slower calculation, maybe you use some frequencies of the data, you've got a sense of probability law, you can compute the probabilities, and then you can get maybe an exact number. You've got to have a threshold, but it's more likely to rain than not. I'm going to go ahead and bring the umbrella. So my question is, how do we apply something like the left, which has been very successful in other contexts, and apply it to something like the right, where when we have these opportunities, people might be making different judgments about them. So our first foray was through a lot of help from an undergraduate, Madeline Haslam. We issued a first study on Amazon Mechanical Turk. We had close to 900 good subjects, good age span, about equal male and female, and they're surveyed from all the way around the continental United States. And so we had a good sampling representative of various ethnicities and political persuasions and so on. And we basically just asked them the following. We want to know how willing they would be to use a fictitious brain stimulation device that comes in a limited supply, so it's not enough for everybody, and tell us the morally acceptability of doing that thing. And so what made this a little bit more interesting was we adopted some of what had been done in pharmaceuticals, but now put it into a neuroenhancement context with brain stimulation, where we have more peripheral functions ranging from reflexes, foreign language, concentration, and so on. are more core functions to their psychological status and agency. Kindness, empathy, your self-confidence, how comfortable you are in social settings. Yeah?
Just curious, what do you think the moral acceptability judgments sort of reflect? Like, is it acceptability for oneself, for society, I think there are really multiple targets that you could kind of think about.
Yep, I'm going to give you the unsatisfying answer that these data won't tell you, but you're asking the right questions that I want you to ask again in about 5 slides. Sound good? You're doing the right thing again, yeah. So there's a story about an editor and reviewership under your question in a second. So we give them little information because in this case, given that I was both equal parts naive to how you might do this, that's an emerging development for myself, and the fact that we have almost nothing about this for brain stimulation, we sort of deliberately gave them very sparse information to see if a basic elicitation would cause the effect. Then we can be asking those questions. So there were a couple of very stark main effects. Let me just throw those up. So people are typically more willing to repair than enhance cognitive functions. This might not be surprising that people are inclined to rehabilitate more than they are just to enhance. They're straddling the midline on enhance there. And they might be more willing to prioritize optimizing in general, whether it's enhance or repair, for others over themselves. Okay, so I'm going to be more willing to do this stuff to somebody else. If we unpack that a bit, this might be a little small, I apologize. People are a little bit more willing to repair traits in others, and that really kind of separates where if I'm thinking about this distinction of others and self for enhancement, I might be equally likely, but I'm kind of going to nudge that up a bit and be pretty willing compared to others to repair others. When I zoom over here to whether or not people will be optimizing core functions versus peripheral functions, they're more willing to optimize core functions in others. So I'm willing to induce changes in your empathy and kindness before mine. And the moral acceptability was shallowly positively related to their willingness. So we're going to get to another version of this in a moment. About 2% of the variance. So to some of us, surprising or not, again, sparse information, it's not clear how they're reasoning, but I just asked you how willing you were, and you're barely telling me how morally acceptable that is in relation to that willingness. So sort of an interesting dichotomy at first. So we dug a little further and we said, all right, well now let's give you the choice. There's only so many of these devices that can do so many things. Deploy them, okay? So again, I'm not telling you to whom, but just generally in the public, only so many. I'm gonna give you each 16 of these things, put as many units as you want on each of those cognitive functions. This is what was returned. So just to orient you, we're going to have all of the abilities down here. We're going to have a distinction between the peripheral and core functions here. And you can kind of scan this at your own leisure for a second, but I just want to call out attention to a couple of my favorites here. This line is what would be expected if it was uniformly distributed, and then this is a standard error. So basically any of these lumps way high or way low are pretty stable representations of the group. So people seem to like things in terms of repair. When you're talking about things like our episodic memory, we like to do our rote memory, our reflexes, sort of basic things that might be functional stuff I need to do to get me through the day. This focus on concentration seems to be a favorite for everyone, for themselves or others. I really enjoy coming over here to this kindness and empathy set. So let that sink in for a second. Notice this color, if you're having a little trouble. Yeah. All right, notice this. I don't need it. None of us need to enhance our kindness and our empathy, but it looks like everybody else does too, so it's sort of interesting there. All right, so individuals prioritize repair and enhancement, and there might be a form of generosity we'd expect in that. Again, these are things that need unpacking quite a bit. I also wonder, is there a fear of consequences to the self? So this is now what gets me to the issue of sensitivity to harm, as you were asking about earlier. So right before we got to that, so I was just sort of interested in, all right, we didn't manipulate the mechanism at all. We have no idea whether it was the brain stimulation per se. And we didn't know if simply having them think at all morally, even before they reported they were willing, had anything to do with their subsequent judgments. So again, an impoverished moral judgment. We're just, again, asking the same exact question, is it acceptable? But I'm doing that before or after it was willing. So basically, am I having you come in and be primed to sort of think like you're hammering on it versus let me stop and think about it. So we used an experimental surveying technique. What I mean by that is we're randomly assigning people to conditions, so we have a little control over the effects. We had the same domains and sampling procedure otherwise, and we just tell them a little bit of mild side effect here, a headache. So you could be suspicious that that's the case, but that's what we tell them. And so what we find is basically that if we have them go and think about education, so somebody sitting in the classroom to improve functions, kind of close to ceiling. So people are quite willing to do this. It didn't matter too much if they were in the moral willing condition first, a little bit of a nudge there for poor and willing. We see that drop off a little bit for drugs. We see that nice bifurcation for non-invasive stimulation. So this is interesting because when we give them willing first, they basically look like education. Just by asking them to think if it's morally acceptable or not, drops this down to be somewhat less acceptable than drugs. And then you might be guessing where this is going. If I say it's an invasive technology, I'm going to put a deep brain stimulator in. This is not people's favorite. And then again, if I think that it's moral, I drop down even further. There's some interesting crossovers here for the sake of expediency. I'll move on, but that got us thinking. So when you mix those factors in, suddenly we're starting to account for more of the variance, so just in a psychometric sense. So about a third of the outcomes were explained now by how acceptable they found it morally. That's encoding the influence of the mechanism and the order in which we have them think about it. So now we have something that's saying, okay, part of the toggles are what I'm using to stimulate you and how I have you think about it. Okay? All right, so finally I'm getting to this issue which our questioner raised earlier of harm and how we manipulate this. So this turned into my excuse to try to finally learn something about behavioral economics, but think about using it in the context that is interesting to me. So a couple of intuitions here. We want to think about things like sensitivity and bias to cognitive gains and losses. So if you were going on and looking at a money paradigm, there are lots of versions. But you might notice that you can give somebody odds that they would gain some money or lose some money, and then there's some dimension of value. And some of the famous findings are basically that people are more or less loss averse especially. We like to hold on to the stuff we have, and you actually have a blunting of additional rewards. So if you've got enough money and a good livelihood, you'd rather hold on to that, and that matters more to you than becoming a multimillionaire. Now what's interesting if you graph that into this cognitive domain, so now let's imagine that the outcome is not money, but your cognitive status. You can notice that you can draw a line for different people, for different cognitive functions. How much do I care about benefits or harms? And how much do I care about trade-offs between domains? So now I can psychologically start to ask people if I change the quantities or the odds that I'm doing well or not on particular dimensions, I can have head-to-head comparisons between risks and benefits in different domains of functioning. Okay? So we can play games like this. Interestingly, and what you don't see too often, is that there are a lot of other things happening in our psychology that aren't what we do on cognitive tasks. So people come in with their stable traits, their values, their ideology, and the history that's going to be part of the story in a moment. So we have sitting in the back Byron Biney, who did a lot of this very good work to pull this down. You're going to see the Ross data from yesterday. So we're going to go ahead. We have a randomizer now where we're just starting out with 7 different cognitive domains. By the way, this is the part where come up to me after the fact if you hate how we've defined this, because there's still a little time to fix it. But what we're trying to achieve here is, can we give people an intuitive takeaway that people in the public will have some sort of intuition about what it means? Then if we were to move to more expert audiences, they would also kind of have some affinity to the terminology. That would allow the comparison between the two. So when we're starting with the public, they'll kind of just drop into one of these bins. They're randomized when they come in. They might get something like this. Please don't read this verbosely, just to give you the bottom line. We train them a little bit about the term they're about to think about. We give them the symptom of the dysfunction. And then basically 3 things can happen in the stimulus. There's going to be odds that it makes it worse, and then a little description of what that means, that it won't affect them at all, or that it cures that deficit. So we're starting again, notice in the negative dimension. We're starting in a sort of, we've had some kind of affliction and we want to make you better. Okay? So they'll get a fixation cross as they go through these trials. They'll be primed and reminded of this information. So just a brief tangent on that. This is really hard to get people to answer what you want them to. We spend months trying to figure out the various ways of doing the stimuli, sitting down and talking to people, making sure we understood their judgments. Is the thing long enough to get them to pay attention? So I want you to think about that not just as the details of cognitive task design, but just figuring out how to get people to answer those questions can be challenging, which should tell you something about how people think about these things in different contexts. In these judgments, we then have the stimuli rendered as follows. So there's going to be some proportion in the visual stimulus, and the choice is simple. They're going to choose, do I give this treatment or not? and that should be in some way related to how much risk of there is of a benefit, a cure, how much risk of harm, and then there's some neutral effect. And we have some parameters to kind of bound and evenly sample that, so we have a fair experiment. And in a nutshell, what we're starting to find is pretty much what you'd expect from these. There's going to be some probability of harm, so that's how much orange there is. That can be ranging from, sorry, that's a little small, from 0 to about 100 up here, so it goes bounded on that interval. And then there's going to be the decision of yes or no. So this particular person, across all of the trials, will at some point stop saying yes to the treatments as a direct function of how much harm there is. This should be intuitive to us. That at some point, there's too much harm for me, I'm going to stop. What's really fun is that different people have clearly different response profiles to different levels of harm. So just like a risk or loss aversion profile in behavioral economics, when I ask it in the context of neuroenhancement, people have similar harm sensitivities, but very importantly, variability across the subjects. So these being fresh data, we have a little bit more to do to plot sort of the benefit side of this and the ratios, but this is a little bit of evidence that our task is starting to work. So once we have that piece of information, this is a very easy quantity that we can use to represent at least those discrete judgments over that distribution. And then this basically opens a gateway to asking these questions a little bit more decisively in the context of modified paradigms. So maybe it's not just the fear, maybe it's something like the aversion or disgust I have when interacting with the technologies. It feels gross to cut into my body and put that thing into me. If you imagine somebody doing surgery to your mother, you might have some reaction about the visceral feeling that that evokes. We might imagine that various religious and political persuasions differ on the dimensions of how likely they are to do these things. We might imagine that the personality of that individual says something about how willing they are to engage with novel stimuli and use them in ways that you might not expect. So some of our preliminary evidence from our surveying suggests that older, more conservative, religious, and spiritual folks are less willing to use neuroenhancement. This might not surprise us too much, but we see those trends. Individuals more open to experience are just initially more willing. And individuals with a high moral weight on purity and harm are less willing. So if you think that there's the idea that there is a pure human being that one can perturb, people are much less likely to want to do something like enhance them with an exogenous device, just at face value, without telling them much else. So what we're doing when we deploy this battery with some of these tasks and various manipulations is we'll be collecting inventories of well-validated survey structures to sort of understand, well, these might be out of domain moral commitments and ideologies that folks have that might predict things like their aversion to particular domains or uses. And then we can do things like, as the questionnaire suggests, start to manipulate the context of those judgments, right? We can change the moral loading or weight. We can frame that differently. We can think about whether or not there is an explicit expectation of how it will be distributed and to whom or not, so on and so forth. And see, what about people's domain general beliefs moderates their willingness to report using those things. So on the other end of that spectrum, and sort of winding down here, I am really, really compelled by the following problem. So here's the little 1-minute story about reviewers. So we submitted an NIH Brain Initiative on this proposal, sort of outlining a deeper, richer version of what I just described to you. The first version of that grant was not accepted for funding. And as I started to interact with reviewers and follow up with program officers and so on, there's a really interesting problem of accessing this end of the equation, right? So I'll tell you this too out loud. It feels weird to me to have somebody come in and start to analyze the way I interact with these sorts of things as a practicing psychologist and now brain stimulator, right? I'd like to believe that I have a reasonably good set of judgments and knowledge to do the right things for people and less of the wrong things. At least I feel like my intentions are good. To invade people in the most expert domain is difficult. They have other things to do with their time. They might not think that it's valuable. There might not be information to be gained, might be the prediction from that. But that's connected to another problem. Are people sensitive not just to the moral issues, but are people doing these things in the real world? And so part of what we're trying to develop in that space is let's try to find a line between these basic mechanisms of psychological function that people have sort of shown are independently predictive in economic spaces. Do the harm sensitivities and sensitivity to moral weights and values predict now behaviors when people come into clinics, when physicians interact with their patients, when somebody decides to consent to the treatment, and so on, to see if we can actually start to decompose what is the individualistic psychological reaction embedded in the larger social context in which they exist. And so in other words, what I'm trying to say is, it's great if we can do these computer tasks and find something about the psychology. It's great if we can go ask people what they think is right and wrong to do. It might be better in the long run to have a vertical integration between these two to be able to predict what in fact will happen. When we think back to that cycle, we might be able to prospect out what is and is not likely to happen in these systems. So I want to leave with this question. I was asked this earlier today. I was trying to dodge it until somebody asked, so I'll just answer it now. So what do I think is right and wrong to do with neuroenhancement? I think that the answer to that entails studying questions like this clearly. I think one of the things I'm really concerned about is the world is changing very quickly. If I think back to things like the history of climate change, we had estimates about things that would come in the future for decades. And what prevented us from making smart decisions earlier was simply admitting our predictions were decent, and then talking about the fact that we can use scientific information to offset unintended harms and consequences. And for that, I think we need a community effort augmented by the best that decision science has to offer. All right, so with that, I think I'm wrapped up. Thanks to Martha and all of you for indulging me today.